Tonight we're going to hear from two amazing economists. Hopefully everyone will enjoy what they have to say. I'm going to hand over to Genelle to introduce the topic. So thanks for coming.
Good evening and welcome everybody. My name's Genelle Aldred. I've been told to introduce myself. No one can ever live up to their bio. But I'm a former journalist for about 13 years. I was a newsreader. And now I'm Deputy Chair of Women in Journalism, I'm a communications consultant, and I've written a book. So that's enough about me. And now we're going to get to the two rock stars that we have with us tonight. So tonight is the, I know, pressure, I'm piling it high. So we've got The Rise of the Intangibles, The Big Miss, a policy briefing. This is co-authored by Stian Westlake, CEO of the Royal Statistical Society, false teeth are in, and Jonathan Haskel, and they've written two books together, Capitalism Without Capital, The Rise of the Intangible Economy, and also, more recently, Restarting the Future, How to Fix the Intangibles. So before I tell you a bit more about them, a bit of housekeeping, phones on silent please. We haven't really all been together for a long time, so we just need to make sure that you'll remember all of those things. And also, if by any reason there is a fire, I'll be the first one out, so follow me through those doors there, and then we'll all get out safely if you form an orderly queue behind me. So a bit more about Jonathan Haskel. As I said, he's a British economist and Professor of Economics at Imperial College Business School. He currently serves as a board member of the UK Statistics Authority, a member and is a member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee. I think that said a little bit there. He's the Chief Executive of the Royal Statistical Society, the UK's leading society for statistics and data science. Previously, he served as advisor to the UK's Science and Innovation Minister, as an Executive Director at Nesta, and for McKinsey and Company in London and Silicon Valley. So we'll dive into the first question of the evening. So in thinking about the intangible economy, we're talking about the big miss. We really wanted just to get into what is that intangible economy. Now, you talk about case studies like Apple, and with Apple, its market capitalization is currently 2.8 trillion, but its tangible assets, mostly buildings and plants and machinery, are valued at less than 2%. Please tell us all what that means.
Brilliant, thank you. And can I just say how nice it is to be in an event in person? Isn't this wonderful? It's so nice. But what you say, what is the intangible economy? Fundamentally, it's based on an economy that's based on things that you can't touch, you can't feel, you can't stub your toe on. Once upon a time, the things that businesses owned, they made money from, was physical things. It was machines, it was factories, it was vehicles. And really, for the last 40 years, that's gradually been changing. So now, and really this has been the case for several years now, the average pound or dollar that businesses in the economy invest goes not into these physical things like machines or buildings, but into things like research and development, organizational development, training, things which create value and which create value in the world, but which are intangible, you can't touch them. And I guess to come back to this question, well, what does that really specifically mean? On the one hand, it means the kind of tech giants that we all know and that dominate our online life. But we also see it in the wider economy, in the kind of less tech economy. And one example I often like to think about is stuff we eat, restaurant sector. We're all familiar with things like Deliveroo and Uber Eats and Just Eat. And really what those have done is they've taken a sector that's really physical, but the restaurant industry used to have capital in the form of kitchen equipment and buildings, tables, and things like that. And it's transformed that industry by creating this whole web of digital connections, of algorithms, of relationships with drivers and with customers, and changing all of our lives and the way that we produce. Then there's kind of a further extension of this if we look at a company like Domino's Pizza. So you could say maybe Deliveroo, Just Eat, maybe they're tech companies as well, or maybe they're kind of adjacent to that sector. But something like Domino's, which has always been a restaurant business, has also transformed itself in the intangible economy. And it's a company, the stock, even with what's happened in the last few months, Domino's stock has done incredibly well over the last 10 years. It's been a kind of a success story on a par with the tech industry. And that's because they have really mastered, they've got a great app, which I they have really embraced not just online, but they've developed their customer relationships in that way. And I guess when we talk about the intangible economy, that's what we need. An economy where these human relationships, technological relationships, and data are transforming everything about the world.
And when we think about all of this, Jonathan, what we're really talking about today is the stalling of this intangible economy. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's right. As Stian has said, there's been this slow change away from the tangible economy towards the more intangible economy. And you might say, Genelle, well, you know, there are changes going on in the economy all the time. You know, why do we have to worry about it? You know, different people move from one side of the economy to another side of the economy. What's interesting and rather depressing is that transition from the tangible economy to the intangible economy has stalled more or less since the financial crisis. So, if you'll forgive me, I'm an economist, I'm going to quote some numbers at you just for a second. So before the financial crisis, intangible investment was growing at around 4% per year. That's a pretty strong growth. After the financial crisis, it's growing at about 3% per year. And I know people like me as economists get terribly excited about 1 percentage point. But if you accumulate up 1 percentage point of growth over many years, you end up with a pretty big number, actually.
And what's that number?
So that number is in the document, is in the paper that we've released today. It turns out to be about £900 per person for every man, woman and child. That's a lot. If you don't like it that way, you can think of it as being around £4 billion per year. In other words, the slowdown means that we're £4 billion per year less well off than we were. And if that's still, for many people, £4 billion is a difficult number to get your head around, the average hospital costs around £500 million. So £4 billion per year is about 8 hospitals.
So that's quite a bit of a stall in terms of how we are not growing. And one of the things that you've spoken about is about access to debt that's needed to grow the intangible economy. Now, there's so many things that we could talk about today, so we've kind of narrowed it down to about 4 topics, and this is one of them. Because to grow that part of the economy, we'd have to speculate to do that. The access to debt is so based around the physical assets that people are used to and are very comfortable with. Plus, you'd already need them to take on the risk in the way the economy works currently for most people. So who is this leaving out? How does creativity get left behind? Okay, we'll start with those two.
Shall I kick off? So, those of you who run your own business will know that the average business in the UK or in most other countries, if it gets money, if it gets external finance from anywhere, it relies on bank loans. So bank loans are a kind of debt. And the nice thing about being a bank is if you lend to a business that owns physical assets, whether that's a building or a machine, if the business isn't good for the money, if it goes bankrupt or if it gets into financial trouble, what the bank will always do is step in and they'll take over the building. So they get some money back. And that's kind of the way the business lending market has worked for hundreds of years. Now, the problem is, along comes the intangible economy, and along comes businesses that don't own a lot of physical assets, that don't own things that the bank can basically repossess if the business fails. So if you run, say, an advertising agency or a kind of creative business that doesn't have a lot of physical assets, you suddenly think, if I want to grow my business, the traditional route of going to a bank and getting a loan suddenly becomes much more difficult. Now, there are some workarounds for this, and being here at Local Globe, we have kind of one example of a workaround, which is venture capital, seed-stage venture capital. That's an equity investment where the investor takes a share in the upside of the business, but is not so worried about the downside. But venture capital is still only accessible to a very small minority of the fastest growing businesses. So that creates a really big challenge that if we want businesses to grow, create jobs and make the world a better place, we've got this kind of 19th century or 18th century financial system based around businesses having lots of assets, but it's not fit for purpose and for the needs of business founders.
And it also, if I could add to that, it also concentrates the borrowing that businesses do against the physical assets in the following, really, I think, quite bad way. As Stian says, these creative businesses, they often don't have any physical assets. They've got a terrific idea, they've got a terrific notion for a marketing opportunity, a good script for a movie, something like that. But there's one physical asset which lots of businesses do have, and that's the house of the director of the So many banks, of course, will take a pledge, Steve's just been describing, against not the physical asset of the car or the truck or the kind of physical assets that businesses used to have, but against the house of the director. So some work we've done at the Bank of England shows that what's happened is the responsiveness of investment to house prices is even greater for intangible investment than it is for tangible investment, because there's more leverage placed on the value of the director's house to raise the money for intangible investment. And that's only going to add to the instability in the economy, as well as the difficulties in raising finance that Stian's just been talking about.
And I guess what we're also thinking about is, especially now, a lot of younger people want to start businesses. They're very creative, they've got brilliant ideas, algorithms, all of the things that you were just speaking about. Some of them don't have houses, so
Sure.
how are we able to make sure there's access available to anyone who has a scalable idea?
So you're absolutely right. This is a huge problem. If you're the people who own large and expensive houses are mostly middle-aged white men in the southeast of England, and that doesn't match well with the universe of business founders we want to encourage. I think there's a few things that we need to do. First of all, we need to make sure that financial institutions in the UK are aware of the huge potential of business founders. So at the moment, a lot of our financial institutions, as we talked about in the report, are quite risk averse. They like companies that generate lots of dividends. They like companies with tangible assets. They're not aware of this world, and they're very reluctant to put money in things like venture capital or growth capital. So there's a kind of learning process and a culture change process for investors. And we think the government probably has a role to play there as well, making sure that the regulations on our financial markets make it easier to invest in these kind of early stage businesses that people are setting up.
Because really it's about shifting power, isn't it? That's the mind shift also as well. So how do we begin to start that? And this is leading nicely into the next question, but how do we begin to start that?
Well, part of it is we need to go away from bank finance if that's the thing which is not fit for purpose. And then the obvious question is what are the other sources of finance that might be out there? So everybody knows, I'm sure, the story of Willie Sutton, who's a famous American bank robber who was jailed, time after time after time. He wasn't a very good bank robber. He was asked in his old age. He was asked, Mr. Sutton, why do you keep robbing banks? And he looked at the interviewer and said, well, that's where the money is. And so the question is, where is the money? And a lot of money, which is potentially out there for investment, is in pension funds and insurance companies. Pension funds, of course, are holding money, quite understandably, for all of our old age, and they're very keen to invest, or in principle they should be very keen to invest in good businesses which are going to pay out returns, which then they can pay for people as they're contractually obliged to do. We have something like 17,000 pension funds in this country, of whom 16,000 have between 2 and 9 members. Right? So the vast majority of pension funds are just very, very small. They are not going to be the kind of investors who are going to do the careful kind of monitoring that you need for intangible businesses, who are going to look hard at the creative ideas that people are bringing to the table, who are going to look hard at the new kind of notions and the new designs, the new software, the new algorithms that people are bringing along, and they want to have some investment in. So we need some reform around all of that to liberate that money a little bit, and so that we're not so dependent upon housing and the traditional forms of tangible investment as a guarantee for investment in this different economy.
Just to let you all know, we are going to have a Q&A session towards the end, so please do, if you have any questions, I'm sure you do. I've got some questions. I will try to let you all have some questions too, but I've got some questions, so we'll have that in a moment. So I wanted to go into thinking about the business growth mindset, because that's something this economy really needs to help to stimulate it. And when we think about the way that business in Britain generally operates, what we're talking about is we regulate big business quite a lot. We tend to discourage conglomerates, emphasis on physical companies. Compared to a country like the US, which you talk about, is this holding us back? Could a Google or an Apple be formed in the UK today and reach that success with our current structures, the way we think about business?
It's going to be difficult for the reasons that we've just been saying. There are a whole set of reasons around financing, and there are a broader set of reasons for intellectual property businesses around intellectual property. So that growth mindset, I think, has got to change a little bit. And we talk about in the latest latest book that we've just written about the intellectual property kind of situation, and how that might be liberalised a little bit to allow these new types of businesses to come in. So I think that the sort of growth mindset, Genelle, that you're talking about, maybe needs some reforms to the kinds of institutions that we've got, which are mostly suited to a more tangible economy.
I think one of the things I find kind of interesting, and I don't know how to get to the bottom of it, is that certainly when I'm in California, there is definitely a kind of an incredible optimism, sometimes to the point of being annoying, but it's kind of, it really is...
Present company exclusive.
Yeah, but I love it. No, it's kind of fantastic, and I don't know, is it from the sun? Is it kind of from the kind of original counterculture there? There is definitely, as you say, there is something about that kind of culture which is really valuable. But on the other hand, there are amazing kind of entrepreneurial growth cultures in the UK as well. And, we've got amazing creative industries. We've got kind of great business founders. So I'm kind of optimistic about the UK from that point of view. It's just the question of how do we harness that mentality.
I guess another question I have is, what size could it actually get to? Because when we talk about, the Americans have the American dream, which I think is so fundamentally in a lot of people's DNA, and you can be anything. I think Britain, we have a real sense of we love an underdog. We love you when you're down. When you get up, not too up, because we don't really know how to handle that. But is it not just about that ambition, about that culture? Is it about market size? Because America's so many times bigger. What is a realistic expectation for us to actually achieve?
Yeah, so it's a little bit more prosaic to talk about market size, but I think that's important actually. The American market size is going to be very helpful, especially in the kind of businesses which are going to require some big upfront costs, which you then need a large market over which to defray. So TV and film would be an obvious example. If one's going to spend a lot of money on TV and film, an intangible asset, of course, the bigger the market, the more you can defray those kind of costs. Maybe that's one of the reasons why an unlikely country like Israel is so successful in the TV and the film industry. When I say unlikely, what I mean is it's a very small country, but it understands the need to have a big market, and therefore is kind of outward looking in the type of creative industries that it employs. But in America, it's going to help to have a uniform language, obviously, one market with uniform language, and it doesn't help us, obviously, to leave the EU. That was that on the basis of having a big market. If you want to have a big market, leaving the EU is not going to help you.
And when we think about the research, when we think about the kind of institutional investors and all of that mindset, when we think about the FTSE 350, do we think that the majority of those businesses understand intangible economy in the way that you're saying we need to look forward to think about it?
I think when you look at the FTSE, whether the FTSE 100, FTSE 350, it does have a lot of traditional businesses in it. So you've got a lot of natural resource extractive businesses, you've got a lot of old school banks. It's quite a traditional index, and I think there's kind of a real challenge in terms of we haven't seen that many tech businesses choosing to list in London recently. Depends what you think about SPACs, but London has not been a centre for SPACs recently. So I think there is really a question if we're thinking about businesses growing and then choosing to go public. The UK doesn't feel like the UK has done that well recently. And I guess that's compounded by some of the things that we're saying about institutional investors. So a lot of, if you hold a FTSE 100 or FTSE 350 income fund, you're not going to have much exposure to really intangible intensive businesses, and that would have really hurt the performance of your savings over the last kind of 10, 20 years. So I think there is an issue there. I know people like the London Stock Exchange have been making some effort to try and put some of that right, but it feels like there's more we can do.
I mean, this is a little curveball that we didn't talk about, but in thinking about the future workforce, is just going to look so different from the workforce that we have now. And I also think the future workforce is so much more ambitious. So how do we marry these two things together, where we have a really institution that doesn't really understand or not exposed to, should I say, doesn't have the knowledge. We have young people who I think are much more savvy, not even in a conscious way, but I just think they get what the intangible economy is and the benefit of it. How do we start to bring these two together?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think one thing that, again, I would be really positive about is talent is something that there's a general shortage of in the world. So if we've got that talent in the UK, there will be ways of accessing finance that, even if interesting as well to see sort of the growth of alternative forms of finance. So things like crowdfunding, which has obviously been a huge burgeoning field in the last 10, 15 years, even some of the kind of crypto sources of financing. My reading of all of that, some of these things are kind of experiments that have not worked out, but the fact that there's been this explosion of different ways of doing things is kind of a sign that there are a lot of businesses seeking equity-like finance that have good ideas, and it's almost that they're sort of conjuring out of the air with this financial innovation. So it feels like sooner or later we're going to get the right model, but we need to make sure that our regulation, the way we run the government is open to finding the right answer.
So we mentioned the big number before, the 143 billion pounds. When we think about the government and when we think about the way it's all working, what fiscal policy should we be considering to grow the intangible economy?
Well, if we can just take a step back before that, Genelle, I just want to emphasise that part of the reason for banging on about these numbers is that a stagnant economy is a zero-sum economy. I think it's a really important message, right? If we've got a stagnant economy and we decide we want to, I don't know, help more people with their energy bills, we have to take money away from somebody else. If we've got a growing economy, that equation becomes much easier. And I think a large part of the kind of difficulties and the conflicts and so forth on the more political side come from that hard and nasty kind of economic factor. I wanted to kind of open with that thought, if I may. And that's part of the reason why, as I say, economists like me obsess about these various numbers and try to think about it. So in terms of fiscal policy, so one thing that governments often do, of course, is they provide all manner of tax breaks for various forms of investment. And there's something called a super deduction, which, I mean, that's got to be good, right? A super deduction. How can that be a bad thing? And that's a very generous tax break that the Chancellor's introduced for firms to invest. But it's a tax break for investment in tangible assets, buildings, plant and equipment. It's not a tax break for firms to invest in the intangible assets. So hats off, encouraging investment is going to be a good thing. But we need to maybe broaden out some of these types of measures to the more intangible side of the economy.
So how do we educate people in the least patronising way possible, like the Chancellor, like ministers making these decisions, to kind of say to them, this is the way forward?
Yeah, it's really, and I think what's interesting when you say educated, this is something that people who are in business know. And often when we talk to them about intangibles, they're like, yeah, of course, this is what modern business is like. As you say, it's politicians who are maybe behind the curve on this. I think one thing, concrete examples is really helpful. So getting people who are in politics to go and see what's happening in businesses, especially entrepreneurial businesses, fast-growing businesses, that really helps. Making them understand that actually the future of the economy, not just the future of the economy in London, but actually the future of the economy in cities and towns across the UK is about applying new technology, human relationships, creativity, all of those kind of things. I think that probably makes a difference. I think that could be helpful.
I'll say another thing as well, if I may, Genelle. I'm not sure we've almost not mentioned in this whole thing R&D, and many policymakers, when they hear that Stian and I are banging away about the intangible economy, they say, yeah, we've got all that sorted out because we're on top of R&D, we know what to do with R&D. And as you'd have heard from the conversation, we think R&D is a very important intangible asset, but it's not the only intangible asset. The other intangible assets are the ones that Stian was talking about right at the very beginning. They are software, all the creativity around books and movies and films, things like that. Design, marketing, training, business organisation, the internal organisation of firms, fantastic supply chain management many of these firms can do. So part of the education process, I think, Genelle, if I may say, is getting people to think beyond R&D. I say that's not to minimise R&D, but getting people to think a little bit broader than that, I think is helpful.
And also outside of London, some of those things become so much better to stimulate economies outside of London. I was listening today to an argument about Crossrail and someone saying it's great for the UK and someone said, no, it's great for London, and actually what's happening in the rest of the country. And actually when you think about the expense of properties in London and how much benefit that gives people when they're investing in tangible assets, when you go up north you don't have that. So if we leave the London bubble, what do you think this could do for the rest of the UK?
Well, it's been so. Earlier this week, there was the launch of Northern Gritstone, which is this big Northern Universities tech spin-out investment fund. That's very much the classical R&D part of the intangible kind of encouraging, because that is risk capital, non-bank finance being put into some intangible intensive businesses. I think it's really interesting to see places looking at stimulating creativity and those kind of businesses, and I see lots of that in places like Birmingham, in Manchester. And I think, more broadly, building those connections and helping cities take advantage of the skills they have I feel we're seeing more of that now.
So if either of you two were in the Chancellor's hot seat, and actually the Californian American dream didn't rub off on him for this, did it? But if you were in his seat today, what would be, kind of the top 3 things that you would be looking at to begin to stimulate the intangible economy?
Well, I think reform of the financial system, as we've discussed, that I think has probably got to come first. We haven't talked very much about cities and planning, but of course a lot of the interactions which are central to the creative process occur in cities. So I think action around planning is going to be important as well. Then we mentioned a little bit about intellectual property as well. Intellectual property, Stian's worked on this extensively, maybe a little loosening of the intellectual property laws might help us too.
What do we need to loosen?
So at the moment, I think there's always there's a dilemma with intellectual property law, whether that's copyrights or patents. On the one hand, if you don't have any copyright or patent law at all, there's not a lot of incentive to come up with a new innovation because it's very easy to copy. But if your copyright laws and your patent laws are too strict, you have a problem like the problem that nearly affected Spotify in their early days. So Spotify obviously deals with lots of other people's intellectual property because they don't own any of the music that you listen to on Spotify. But they clearly add a ton of value because they've created this amazing service that allows you to stream music and select music and all these other things. And what they always told me about their early days was that the record labels really didn't want it to exist. They were very keen to basically sue Spotify out of existence. And they just about made it through because the intellectual property laws, the laws on music copyright, were just about loose enough that they could kind of get through to the stage where they were viable and let people thought, well, actually, this is a really valuable service. We can't let this be litigated out of existence. So you kind of want to make sure that your intellectual property laws are tight enough that people can protect things that they've created, but not so tight that people can't come and innovate on top of those. And I think in practice what that means is places like the Intellectual Property Office that runs these things have to know about new technology, which requires kind of investment in those institutions to make sure they're up on these things. And we've got to make sure that we protect the people who are doing that from some of the quite crass lobbying that you used to see. So in my former job, one of the things that the minister I advised worked on was intellectual property law. And so we meet very regularly the lobbyists from the rights holders, whether that was the Premier League or the big movie studios, and you've never met such slick lobbyists. They were so smart, they were so nice, and you'd be in a meeting with them for an hour and you'd think at the end, wow, those people must be paid a lot of money. And they were, because these were businesses that their absolute incentive was to get the government to change laws in their favour. And often these people own news studios, these companies. They are people who government ministers, all else equal, really want to please. But to go back to your original question, if you're the Chancellor and what you really care about is helping businesses, helping the economy and helping consumers, you have to have the backbone to stand up to the really slick people who come in from the Premiership or the record labels and say, tighten the laws in my interests and it will be in your interests. So it's that resisting lobbying.
So there's a whole culture, power, mind shift that needs to happen. Your report's been released today. I just want to hand over to you just to give your top takeaway that you would love people to take away today.
We can do better. We're falling behind on our investment. If we could get our investment back to the pre-financial crisis levels, back to American levels, we can do better.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot to be pessimistic about in the economy today, but our message in some ways is one of optimism, which is that, we were going up like that. We kind of dipped because of this lack of investment in intangibles. And the nice thing about falling behind is it's easier to catch up. We're not calling on the country to do something that we've never done before. We're saying it's about refinding our mojo and updating our institutions.
Brilliant. Thank you both so much. roving mic, if you put your hand up and I will come to you. It's hard to be the first one to ask a question because you're both so smart. It's like, I really hope that my question is on track. This lady here at the front.
You talked about city planning. Thank you. You talked about city planning. Can you say a little bit more about that? What do cities, particularly outside London, need to think about if they're to really get ahead with this agenda?
Shall I? So, I guess the principle here is that in the intangible economy, intangibles have got lots of spillovers, so learning from other people's ideas is really valuable, and they have lots of synergies, which means if you can combine your ideas with other people's ideas, they're really valuable. And Zoom notwithstanding, a lot of that still happens face to face. Now, I guess what that means is what we don't want is we don't want cities where housing is really expensive, so it's really hard to afford to work, to live somewhere or to set up an office. And actually, all else equal, you want people to be able to get together in thriving places. You want cities to be able to grow. Now, the UK, for a whole set of complex reasons, has some problems with our kind of, what you could call sort of core cities, the cities smaller than London. And one of those problems is that, probably for reasons to do with transport and the way public transport works, it actually takes a really long time to get around them. So getting around Birmingham takes a lot longer than getting around a city of 2 or 3 million people in Europe, partly because there's less public transport and more car dependent, there's more traffic. And so one of the things that I think is really important is to just invest in public transport. The factoid that always plays in my mind is that Leeds is the largest city in Europe that doesn't have a metro system. We've just underinvested in stuff in the UK. So that'd be one thing. I think the other thing is when we think about things like R&D, which is also important. I think one of the kind of weird historical accidents about the UK is historically we spent a lot of money on science in these two sort of very picturesque small towns in Oxford and Cambridge, which are full of very beautiful buildings, but are surrounded by greenbelt, very hard to build anything in, have extremely expensive housing, and have quite a sort of monoculture. That's quite unusual. If you go to somewhere like Germany, the public money they spend on R&D is much more spread around different cities. It's much more diversified. And the problem with putting so much of our public R&D funding in these places where it's very hard to build things is it becomes very hard if you want to employ people in those areas. The living costs are really high. It's hard to set up businesses. So I would say, invest in public transport, spread our R&D funding more widely. Those would be my top two.
As a Birmingham girl, I will definitely concur with the transport. This lady over here.
Obviously, in this area, pre-financial crisis, there were no amazing tech companies here, really. So I'm actually shocked by your research. It's really surprising and it's really interesting. Did you count the US tech companies that are, for example, growing in the UK in your research?
So the measurements, basically, they do count kind of international businesses that operate in the UK. And I think, you're absolutely right, this does kind of make it even more shocking, because we've all seen around ourselves that actually there have been aspects of the UK tech sector that's really grown since 2010 at least. I think what this really shows is that intangibles is not just a tech industry story, it's kind of across the economy that you really feel the benefit of them. So the fact is that, while we've been lagging on intangible investment, even though we've seen relatively strong growth in our tech sector. I think what's really interesting is if you look at, say, domestic investment in intangibles by US tech companies, for example, that's growing even faster. So the amount of R&D and other things that people like Facebook are doing in the US, that's kind of gone through the roof into the UK. But it brings home how stark the drop-off is.
So two kind of sort of slightly nerdy questions. One is, how do you look at the sort of relative returns on investment between intangible versus physical assets? And secondly, how do you prove to banks that actually investing in intangible assets actually hold value over time? Because unless you can prove that, how do you actually persuade financial institutions to kind of recalibrate what they're investing in?
So when we do all these valuations, this is going to be a very nerdy answer, forgive me. So when we do the various valuations and work out how much the extra flow of GDP would be and all of that, we assume that that returns are equalised between tangibles and intangibles, just as a sort of baseline assumption, adjusting for risk. That's what you want to be the case. So the calculations are all internally consistent, if you see what I mean, in a sort of GDP sense, because when we do GDP, we have to make all those various kinds of assumptions. As far as proving all this stuff to banks is concerned, we talk about this a little bit in the book. I mean, part of when Stian was describing these debt contracts, part of the point about debt contracts is they're cognitively very low-load contracts, right? If you take an equity stake in somebody, in a firm, you've got to find out a lot about the firm. You've got to figure out are they going to be profitable, they're not going to be profitable, is it going up, is it going down, when's the best time to get out, when's the best time to go in, when's the best time to buy low, sell high, all that kind of thing. If you offer a firm a debt contract, you only have to work out one thing, which is can they pay the flow of money on the payment. It doesn't matter if they become the world's most valuable company, you don't care about that, you just care about the flow of money. So it's a cognitively sort of low-load process to invest in the tangible economy. So in terms of proving this to banks, it's somewhat of a struggle because they're not used to these more different forms of finance. And so that's why this needs to be done.
I mean, I would be maybe even more pessimistic about that and say, fundamentally, a lot of these very intangible intensive businesses are just not investable for a standard bank business loan book. I mean, I think this is a real problem. This sort of our sort of stylized view is that really intangible intensive businesses, you tend to get this very sharp divide between the leader firms who do really well because the intangibles, when you've got the right mix of intangibles, they all combine in wonderful ways. You get companies like Apple that just kind of go up and up, and the rest kind of lag behind. The leader lagger gaps in intangible intensive sectors are really high. But intangible intensive sectors, you tend to get the opposite. You get mean reversion. And that's great news if you're a kind of low cognitive load bank loan officer, because it basically means if you made a stupid bet this year, it'll be fine next year, probably. So the low cognitive load model works quite well. If you've got a sector where actually what really matters is picking the one winner, and you're the bank loan officer and you lend to 7 out of the 8 businesses in that sector, and then a venture capitalist like Saul comes along and uses his brain to find the one company that's going to pull away, your loan book is stuffed, and you're going to really lose out. So I think this is a real fundamental problem for if banking is the way that we finance new businesses.
Hello. So you cite the United States in its investment in the intangible industry, which makes perfect sense because they play host to the largest intangible companies there is. Apple, Microsoft, Facebook, Google, Amazon. Now, from a critical standpoint, these companies come with their own set of problems that affect the country pretty broadly. Monopolization of industries, monopolization of labor markets. They open an office in a new city and the cost of living skyrockets, etc. On the other hand, the United States as a whole is currently in quite a severe trade deficit across all levels of goods, with their only trade surplus being in services, which I find to be a particularly precarious position to find yourself in as a country. So how do you introduce an intangible economy in the UK in a way that considers the problems that the United States is having, but also embeds equitability in its foundation? I'm thinking of treating intangibles like a resource the same way Norway uses its oil wealth in nationalizing that resource. Is that even possible in us? I'm not the economist or the expert on the stage. But yeah, I'm just curious about that.
So I think it's a really good question. How do you, especially looking at the trade deficit issue? And I guess one thing, when I think about intangibles, I would say that it's not just kind of tech platforms and service businesses that get their competitive advantage from intangibles. If we look at, say, the German manufacturing sector and German kind of Mittelstand companies, which export vast amounts and kind of underpin Germany's kind of huge balance of payments surplus. They have tangible capital, they have factories, but the reason they're so incredibly competitive and the reason they generate so much export revenue is really, I would argue, they're intangibles. It's to some extent their R&D, but also their kind of industrial know-how, the skills that are embodied in their workforce, and things like the kind of service support offering that they offer for their products. All of which basically mean that you have these strange companies in small towns in Germany that own the global market for things, and in theory you think, why doesn't China kind of outcompete them? It just turns out that they can continually keep at the forefront. So I think if we want an economy that exports a lot, and if we decide we want an economy that exports lots of manufactured goods, intangibles is kind of the root of that success. Do you want to talk about the competition point, because that's a separate issue?
Yeah, but also to emphasise very strongly that, as we said in the answer to the question earlier on, intangibles is much more than just tech companies. So you're absolutely right that the US is the location of some of those top intangible companies, but it's much, much broader than that. If it were just that, the US wouldn't have so much of a lead, as important though they are. They don't dominate the whole economy. On the competition side, so the competition issues around monopoly and monopsony and so forth, we think have to be quite carefully looked at, actually, because part of the reason why these companies can scale up is because of the very properties of intangibles that Steve was mentioning earlier on. Once you've got a good algorithm, you can scale up. Once you've got a good algorithm and good design and good supply chain management, you can get the synergies between those things and become large and so forth. And so therefore what's happened is it's in the intangible sectors that the gap between the leaders and the laggards has gone up. That may lead to sort of an abuse of monopolistic power, but it may not do, actually. There may be situations in which we actually quite like to be on Facebook and big social media platforms, because we don't want to be on lots of small social media platforms because we can't talk to our friends. So we're a little cautious about antitrust policy. Certainly antitrust policy needs to move if there's an abuse of the monopoly situation, but it's not 100% clear that just because these firms are big that the abuse is taking place.
Thank you, that's all we have time for the questions, but there is a chance to network. I have smelt the canapes earlier, they're very nice, so do stay, have another drink, have some canapes. A few thank yous, or should I do it? Thank you, Saul. That's my first thank you. The second thank you is to Jonathan and Stian. Thank you so much for sharing your report with us today and answering all the questions. Heather Farnborough, where are you, Heather? She was the editorial, I can't speak now. She was the editorial lead on this project and pulled a lot of it all together and definitely helped tonight with us forming all of these thoughts together. Also want to thank Phoenix Court and their partners, the Stack World, Black Seed, Black Girls Fest Launchpad Programme, Black Global Trust, the Design Museum, Newton Venture Programme, Burlington PR, Milltown Partners, Fat Macy's, YC UK and Phoenix Court Works. And thank you for being an amazing audience.